Hello, my name is Sam, and today I'm going to give you a guided tour of the exhibit Rauschenberg 100, a Centennial Celebration by the artist Steve Keene. This exhibit was on display from August until December in 2025 at the Bob Rauschenberg Gallery in Fort Myers, Florida. The gallery is about 32 miles east of Captiva Island, where Rauschenberg lived and worked until his death in 2008. Steve Keene is an American painter known as a prolific creator of affordable art. I have many other videos about his work on my channel. In this exhibit, Keene paints a biography of Rauschenberg over the course of 53 images in duplicate for a total of 106 paintings. In this video, I will talk about those paintings. It should be noted, however, that the curator of this exhibit, Jade Dellinger, displays both the remnants of materials used to create the exhibit along with works from Keene's previous exhibit at the gallery to extend the show into the lobby and foyer of the building in a nod to Rauschenberg's quarter mile at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Rendered in his signature carnival palette, Keene's twin paintings of Jasper Johns, seated before his own target, 1958, evoke both mid-century austerity and a comic book brashness that sidesteps nostalgia. The source photograph, a sober black and white portrait, presents Johns as contemplative, surrounded by bottles and domestic clutter, yet flanked by an icon of his own making. Keene doubles this mise-en-scène, exaggerating the angularity of John's posture and the symmetry of the bottles, turning the tidy stillness of the photo into a frieze of shapes and rhythm. The bottles, now bright and nearly identical, are rendered like trophies or props, their labels abstracted to pure color blocks. The target becomes less an artwork and more an emblem, flattened and distilled, almost corporate in its reproducibility. Keene's pair of works differ subtly. In one, Johns' gaze skews toward the viewer, while in the other, it tilts inward, as though caught between self-awareness and performance. Both paintings are less about Johns per se than the act of reproducing his aura. The birthday photo of Billy Kluver, beaming behind a thicket of candle flames, serves as both document and effigy in Keene's twin tributes. Sourced from a warmly lit snapshot likely taken in the late 20th century, the image is scrubbed of photographic softness and re-rendered with Keene's usual arsenal: blunt brushwork, graffiti-adjacent scrawls, and high saturation color. The words "Billy Kluver Birthday" pressed diagonally across the frame, less label than proclamation, anchoring the compositions with a sense of event. Keene leans into the warmth of the moment, smile, candles, suit, but he also thickens it into myth. The two versions crackle with small differences. A glowing halo of candlelight flares brighter in one, while the eyes squint harder in the other, bordering on abstraction. If Kluver was the unseen engineer behind some of Rauschenberg's most ambitious works, here Keene flips the script, spotlighting the technician's joy as a kind of ephemeral, quietly radiant art object in itself. Keene's paired paintings riff on a 2005 photograph of Twombly standing before Untitled, Say Goodbye Catullus, to the shores of Asia Minor, his monumental 1994 canvas with all the subtlety of a band flyer. In the original image, Twombly appears almost swallowed by the vastness of his own mark-making, a quiet figure adrift in a sea of memory, myth, and gestural haze. Keene seizes on the contrast and flips the register. The airy lyricism of Twombly's painting is transformed into hard-edged arcs of blue and red, while Twombly himself becomes a jittery icon, eyes wide, body blocky, outlined in urgent black. The text, C.Y. Twombly and Gagosian, spills down the canvas edges like a ransom note from the art market, loud and insistent. There's weight behind that naming. Gagosian became Twombly's primary dealer in the artist's final decades, shaping his late career reception with sleek institutional gravity. The very inverse of Rauschenberg's restless, collaborative ethos. Yet it was with Rauschenberg that Twombly had first ventured outward. The two met in 1951, studied together at Black Mountain, and shared a formative journey through Europe and North Africa. Keene's paintings, intentionally or not, seem to loop that arc, not just revisiting a photograph, but collapsing myth, market, and memory into a two-panel shout. Keene's two paintings reimagine Rodeo Palace, Spread, 1975-76, not as a tactile sprawl of materials, but as a kind of jubilant stage set, collapsing the original's deep surface play into a flattened field of gesture and cartoonish symmetry. Where Rauschenberg layered fabric, cardboard, and transfer imagery with architectural weight, a literal scattering of thresholds and embedded stories, Keene opts for bold patterning and formal clarity. He fixates on the doors, making them central characters, their angles exaggerated like cutouts from a pop-up book. The soft diffusion of Rauschenberg's imagery becomes radiant yellow, electric blue, and coral red. The painterly index of solvents and transfers is replaced by bright frontal declarations. Notably, Keene isolates key motifs. The pale in the upper right becomes a crisp, comic emblem, and the patchwork upper panels are reimagined as grids of color, almost like windows in a child's drawing of a building. It's a telescoping of time and texture, reframing the spread not as sediment, but as signal. In Keene's exuberant translation of a beachside photograph showing Rauschenberg, David Bradshaw, and Savannah Lily Bradshaw in a stacked trio of grinning limbs, the original's warmth becomes something mythic. The 1970s snapshot, with its handwritten IDs and gentle ripples of Gulf Coast water, is an intimate record. Equal parts family portrait and artist hangout. Keene, true to form, retains the totemic composition, but dials up the theatrics. Each figure is rendered with emphatic brushstrokes in hot reds and sunburnt pinks, their bodies outlined like figures from a Pacific Northwest carving or a WPA mural. The setting has shifted from sea to studio wall, palm bursts replacing gentle horizon, and in lieu of scrawled names, Keene plants a slogan at the bottom. At the beach in a studio, Rauschenberg. It's an intentional fracture, both more declarative and less specific. The gesture replays the camaraderie as a stylized fable, the artist's studio not just a site of production, but as an extended performative space of family, joy, and play. Keene's pair of paintings, based on a performance still from Minutiae, 1954, transpose the electric geometry of Rauschenberg's stage backdrop into a kind of jubilant folk abstraction. The original photo captures a dancer mid-motion, framed by the vibrant clamor of Rauschenberg's minutiae, a freestanding collage construction that hums with reds, pinks, and occluded mirrors, like a theater curtain made from memory fragments. Keene translates this into planar exuberance, flattening the forms into stacked blocks and pattern fields, rendered in hot cadmium and lemon yellow, his brushstrokes moving like dancers themselves. The text, with Rauschenberg, the Cunningham Dancers, decor, is painted with the urgency of hand-lettered signage, as if announcing a traveling show. This isn't documentation. It's a painted echo of a collaboration that was never still to begin with. With the deadpan theatricality of a commemorative mural, Keene's diptych, based on Richard Avedon's 1960 photograph of Cage, Cunningham, and Rauschenberg, collides with a later image of Rauschenberg in profile, grinning. The hybrid is strange and precise. Avedon's trio, caught mid-gesture in the studio's crisp void, are reimagined in gestural slabs of teal and carmine, their striped suits rendered like jazz riffs in gouache. But it's the grafting of the older Rauschenberg onto the composition, looming in right-facing profile and bearing a halo of citrus yellow, that tips the image into satire. He appears as a kind of retrospective mascot, chuckling at the younger men as if aware of the myth in real time. This is a bicentennial minute. Keene scrawls across the top, repurposing a phrase from a patriotic PSA series to frame this avant-garde convergence as a historical vignette. It's a knowing wink, the vanguard already on a postage stamp. Keene's painted versions of Minutia, 1954, reimagine Rauschenberg's unstable, sculptural patchwork as a graphic thrum of carnival geometry. The original's eccentric stage flat, draped with cloth, impaled with poles, teetering on found legs, becomes, in Keene's hands, a flattened proscenium bristling with design. Gone are the sutures and surface scars of the actual construction. In their place, he delivers a pulse of interlocking reds, golds, and ultramarines, as if choreographed by a Bauhaus color theorist on deadline. The two versions mirror each other with slight adjustments in tilt and mood, one brisk and outlined, the other more absorbed in color density. Neither aims to reproduce Rauschenberg's material logic. Instead, Keene captures the work's essence as a portal, a theatrical threshold built not to contain meaning, but to scatter it. Keene's two renditions of Retroactive 2, 1963, strike a jarring chord of recollection and reconstitution. Based on Rauschenberg's original painting, which famously fused Kennedy's media image with Cold War spectacle, Keene offers a distillation filtered through comic urgency. The black and white half-tone gravitas of the original JFK gives way to a blocky, canary yellow mask of leadership, edged in red and blue like a televised afterimage. Keene's astronaut has been stiffened, geometrized, its drift transformed into diagram. Both versions retain the palette's vibrational push, warm reds, ice blues, but diverge in emphasis. In one, Kennedy's pointing finger becomes a bold vector. In the other, the focus shifts upward toward the spectral female heads above. Where Rauschenberg's piece layered photographic silk screens like sediment, Keene slices through the strata with house paint decisiveness, flattening history, while simultaneously insisting on its urgent theatricality. This set of paintings spring from a now iconic photograph of Rauschenberg standing beside Buffalo 2, 1964, the monumental silkscreen canvas that earned him the International Grand Prize in Painting at the 32nd Venice Biennale, the first American to receive the honor. The original photo captures a moment of poised intensity. Rauschenberg, cigarette in hand, flanked by the cool, collaged iconography of American power, JFK's visage, a bald eagle, a NASA astronaut, images layered with irony and national myth. Keene's versions dial up the heat, transposing the scene into his signature brash palette and hand-lettered zeal. The text, Rauschenberg about to get Golden Lion in Venice, spills across the bottom like a tabloid headline, while transferred and screened images slices diagonally, linking the source material's silkscreen techniques to Keene's own process of image recycling. These aren't mere homages, they're kinetic echoes, recasting a canonical moment of Cold War-era American art in the frenetic visual language of contemporary folk memory. These paintings brings together two portraits of Robert Rauschenberg drawn from distinct moments in his life. The young artist crouched on the floor beside Rocky the turtle and beer can, cigarette in hand, and the older man smiling, arms folded over the back of a ladder. Reinterpreted through loose, expressive brushwork and saturated color, the paired images are united under the text, "Born 100 years ago, Rauschenberg, October 22nd, 1925, anchoring the work as a centennial tribute." The turtle appears again in stylized form at the bottom of the composition, echoing the early photograph and serving as a subtle emblem of continuity. With its layered gestures and vivid palette, the piece compresses time, portraying Rauschenberg not as a fixed historical figure, but as an enduring presence moving freely between moments. These two panels pull from a pair of photographs that bookend Rauschenberg's early life. On the left, a famous studio portrait taken later in his career with arms crossed and a knowing smile, and on the right, a World War II-era snapshot showing the young sailor stationed in California, posing with a girl on a plinth between him and a fellow serviceman. Keene renders both images with his typical bold, gestural shorthand, but it's the right-hand vignette, framed by a palm tree and loosely described architecture, that does the narrative lifting. The trio's pose, the central figure elevated and flanked by men in uniform, is handled with a kind of cartoon solemnity that is undercut by the flat joy of Keene's palette. This reverent irreverence is heightened by the lurid reds in bellboy pink, lettered down the right side, a cue not only to the girl's dress, but to the showman's tone Keene brings to biographical history. Meanwhile, SK Studio, stamped in the top left, emphasizes the self-conscious frame. This is Keene's version of the Rauschenberg origin myth, painted like a promo poster for a story already known. Keene's pair of paintings riff on Rauschenberg's Booster, 1967, a 6-foot-tall lithograph that famously combined a full-body X-ray with schematic notations, chair imagery, and ghostly traces of American life. Keene distills this dense, spectral composition into a rhythmic parade of flattened, almost tribal figures and scaffold-like structures, repeating the motif in two slightly varied registers. More yellow highlight here, a tighter frame there. Keene flattens the body scan's forensic intimacy into a syncopated graphic pattern. The skeletal torso, once eerie and diagnostic, becomes a stylized emblem as if echoed through pop signage, by writing Booster 1967 Big Lithograph Rauschenberg. Across the bottom, Keene performs a kind of verbal underlining, rendering the source material not only visible but loudly declared, collapsing citation into celebration. These two works by Keene distill and electrify a 1950s cyanotype collaboration between Rauschenberg and Susan Weil, wherein Weil's body served as subject and surface in cameraless photographic exposures. The cyanotype shown here, where Weil appears doubled in stacked crouching poses, becomes, in Keene's repainted version, a fiercely graphic composition. The forms are flattened and mirrored, outlined with vibrating strokes of white, yellow, and pale blue, making them resemble both radiographic figures and cubist totems. Keene scrawls Rauschenberg and Susan Weil down the sides like vertical neon signs, asserting a kind of marquee authorship while maintaining the collaborative spirit of the original. In doing so, he both pays homage to and restages the cyanotype's uncanny energy, amplifying the bodily distortion and expressive force through his own raw, cartooned line work. Keene's painted pairing here captures two discrete yet deeply entangled moments in Rauschenberg's creative and performative life. On the left side of both compositions, Keene draws from a 1960s photograph of Rauschenberg lifting Carolyn Brown during a performance with Judson Dance Theater, a tableau at once devotional and strange, encircled by collaborators whose roles blur between ceremony and improvisation. Keene exaggerates their postures into cartoon-like rigidity, injecting an almost sacred absurdity into the moment. On the right, he transposes a young, seated Rauschenberg, photographed by Jasper Johns in 1958, before 3 pinned-up transfer drawings, into a bright yellow room of floating grids. The juxtaposition of these 2 source images within each panel suggests a generative split in Rauschenberg's practice between the bodily and the diagrammatic, between movement and mark-making. Keene doesn't resolve this tension. Instead, he saturates it with his own signature mix of brash immediacy and affectionate distortion. Keene's 2 paintings riff on Peter Moore's 1965 photograph of spring training, Rauschenberg's contribution to the Once Again Festival, held atop a Maynard Street parking structure in Ann Arbor. The original image captures a young Lucinda Childs in mid-stride, Rauschenberg standing barefoot in trunks and a patterned shirt and a pair of turtles stationed improbably amid theatrical lights and shadows. Keene takes this strange tableau and dials up the theatricality, restaging it in a candy-colored palette that teeters between tribute and parody. The turtles vanish, replaced by an almost diagrammatic depiction of open-score era experimentation, with arrows, spotlights, and bold lettering guiding the eye. In one version, Rauschenberg's gaze seems wary. In the other, it's more confident. Tiny shifts that echo his own balancing act between vulnerability and control. Keene doesn't recreate the performance so much as re-choreograph it, flattening its ambiguity into a pop-iconic frieze where history and myth blur under fluorescent lights. This pair is based on a 1958 photograph by Kay Harris of Robert Rauschenberg in his Front Street studio in New York, posing with the Second State of Monogram, 1955 to 1959, Second State, 1956 to 1958, surrounded by early Combine works including Interview, Untitled, Bed, and Odalisque. Keene reimagines this formative moment in Rauschenberg's career not as static documentation, but as a compressed field of visual energy. He stylizes the young artist and the goat into graphic silhouettes rendered in electric lines, enveloped by abstracted references to the original assemblages. The text eliminates distinction between art plus life, floats amid the fractured geometry, echoing not just Rauschenberg's philosophy, but Keene's own method of remixing art history into a restless, painterly language. Peering intently at a strip of slides through a magnifying glass, Rauschenberg is captured in a moment of concentrated transition, his gaze set on the future. The source photo, taken in the LACMA studio during preparations for 1/4 mile or 2 furlong piece, serves as Keene's template for 2 vibrantly claustrophobic paintings, where desks, hands, and tools collapse into a single rhythmic tangle of gesture. The palette is high-keyed and acidic, yellows, reds, aquas, pulling the studio into the visual language of the silk screens themselves. In both panels, Keene's graffiti-like script splits across corners, declaring, "After Combines came the silk screens." What had been a quiet moment of looking becomes, in Keene's hands, a carnival of forward motion, a kinetic homage to the moment Rauschenberg rearmed his practice. Keene's twin canvases take as their source a pair of striking photographs of Rauschenberg from different decades, reframing them within the controversy surrounding Canyon, 1959, a Combine painting that famously incorporated a stuffed bald eagle. The text in Keene's paintings foregrounds the unexpected legal drama that erupted when the work collided with the 1940 Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. The portraits, one of Rauschenberg in his studio, the other grinning beside collaborator David Bradshaw, are filtered through Keene's blunt, schematic brushwork, giving both men a pop icon bluntness. Above their shoulders looms the spectral eagle, rendered in gestural streaks, as if mid-dissolve into the mythos of the combine itself. Keene's approach preserves the original tension between playful invention and governmental constraint, while injecting the scene with a manic optimism, as if the artist still believes that painting can reclaim symbols from law and legend alike. These vivid paintings by Keene reinterpret a seminal moment in Robert Rauschenberg's creative life, his participation in 9 Evenings, Theater and Engineering, 1966, a groundbreaking series of performance experiments that brought artists and engineers together. Based on a photograph of Rauschenberg being carried during rehearsals for his piece Open Score, Keene's compositions exaggerate the theatricality and collaborative energy of the scene with bold colors, jagged brushwork, and radiant halos. Text phrases like lifelong commitment to collaboration and carrying Rauschenberg are not just literal, but celebratory, underlining Rauschenberg's enduring belief in creative partnership across disciplines. The figures stretch dynamically across the canvas, bathed in bursts of red and yellow, while references to technology and performance pulse at the edges, echoing the innovation that defined the original event. Keene's paired paintings of Rauschenberg among villagers in rural China translate a moment of cultural encounter into a jagged, high-chroma frieze of faces, palms, and hats. In both panels, the scene is arranged like a tableau. Rauschenberg at center, flanked by young men and boys, their gazes both curious and candid. The background palms are rendered as rhythmic black slashes against a turquoise field, echoing brush calligraphy while framing the group in a ceremonial grove. Keene scrawls, emphatically gestural and handmade, across the top, as if paraphrasing the ethos of Rossi, while the bottom text grounds the work in time and place. Rauschenberg in China, Rossi, 1985. The palette shifts slightly between the two versions, one more sunset warm, the other bleached and electric, but both preserve a sense of mutual attention and dignity. By choosing this photograph as source material, Keene points not to spectacle, but to exchange, embedding the politics of visibility within his own unvarnished, emphatic mark-making. Keene's paintings referencing Buffalo 2, 1964, directly engage with one of Rauschenberg's most iconic silkscreen works, a dense collage of political and cultural imagery from the era of JFK. In Keene's vibrant reinterpretations, the formal structure of Rauschenberg's original is echoed through flattened space, overlapping symbols, and bold color zones, while the twin figures of Kennedy dominate the composition, just as in the original. This homage highlights not only the visual language Rauschenberg pioneered, merging mass media, political iconography, and painterly gestures, but also underscores how Buffalo 2 crystallized the chaotic optimism and tension of 1960s America. By foregrounding this work in the exhibit, Keene nods to its enduring influence on Rauschenberg's practice and its centrality in post-war American art. Keene's vibrant diptych of Pinky and the Blue Boy serves as a sharp and playful nod to the formative visual culture that surrounded Rauschenberg in his Texas youth, where reproductions of these two grand manner portraits were a fixture in mid-century homes. Their constant, almost kitsch ubiquity, particularly at the Huntington, where they faced one another for nearly a century, left a lasting impression on Rauschenberg, who would later cite them as some of the first artworks to register with him as images with weight. Keene's versions retain their stiff, iconic poses, but detonate the tonal restraint of the originals, infusing them with comic book immediacy and backlit color halos. Rather than parody, the effect is affectionate amplification, a tribute to the mass-circulated art that helped shape Rauschenberg's early sense of image and spectacle, and a reminder that his later innovations in collage and cultural sampling didn't come from nowhere. Keene translates a historic moment from Rauschenberg's 1963 performance Pelican into his trademark syntax of theatrical immediacy and angular energy. The source image captures Rauschenberg mid-performance, on roller skates, holding a dancer aloft, both flanked by men in winged costumes, during the 9 evenings of theater and engineering. Keene's 2 versions wrestle with the dynamic tangle of limbs and fabric, amplifying the ballet's absurd mechanics. The repeated phrase, 9 nights of eat, and the red halo of brushstrokes summon not just the event's name, but its atmosphere, frenetic, earnest, and slightly chaotic. Bianca Jagger stands before one of Rauschenberg's monumental works at Thaddeus Ropac in 2023. Keene renders the photograph with characteristic speed and punch, reducing her crisp elegance to bold brushwork and flattening the silkscreen layers of the original work behind her into rhythmic patterns of red, yellow, and blue. The image becomes a curious reversal. Rauschenberg, known for layering figures into complex visual fields, is here pushed into the background as a flattened compositional device, while Jagger becomes the dominant subject. Keene's 2 interpretations of Signs, 1970, are among his most compositionally dense works in this series, and among the few that replicate another of Rauschenberg's own silkscreen-based prints. Originally commissioned by Time magazine in 1970, Rauschenberg's Signs functions as a collage of iconic and traumatic images from the 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr., JFK and RFK, Janis Joplin, the Vietnam War, and the Apollo moon landing. While Keene maintains the core structure and color palette of the original montage, his painterly translation transforms the figures into rough, mask-like forms, all floating within a flattened chaos of visual noise. The most direct reference is the silhouetted astronaut, originally Neil Armstrong, whose gold helmet remains the most legible element in Keene's version. Around it, however, Keene's brushy hand and chromatic improvisations reduce other figures into clustered heads and gestural shapes, turning Rauschenberg's haunted but reverent historical pastiche into a carnivalesque blur of mediated memory. In New Technologies of Transfer, Keene reimagines a 1983 photograph by Terry Van Brunt of Rauschenberg, seated in his Leica Lane studio on Captiva Island, surrounded by the 1/4 mile or 2 furlong piece, 1981 to 98, in progress. The original image captures Rauschenberg mid-thought, resting his chin on his hand, an introspective moment that Keene transforms into a brash, expressive composition. The layered transfers and cutouts that surround Rauschenberg in the photo are recast in Keene's bold brushwork as frenetic bursts of color and line. By translating the scene into his own painted idiom, Keene not only pays homage to Rauschenberg's techniques, but also mirrors his process of visual translation and appropriation. Clad in a massive fur parka, a defiant Rauschenberg stands before the skeletal piers of the East River in Gianfranco Gorgoni's photograph, with the Brooklyn Bridge stretching above like an exclamation point to his unorthodox practice. This now iconic image of the artist looking for trash in New York, scrap material for his combines, is transformed by Keene into a brash diptych of painterly insistence. In both renditions, Keene pushes the image into graphic territory, exaggerating the fur collar into a radiating halo and flattening the bridge into jagged geometry. Where the photograph frames Rauschenberg as mythic scavenger against the decaying grandeur of the city, Keene refracts that myth through a streetwise punk rock idiom, as if the artist were a superhero of assemblage, cloaked in scavenged iconography and urban grit. Keene's two interpretations of Rauschenberg's Pelican, 1963, based on Gianfranco Gorgoni's photograph of the performance, operate like stenciled echoes shouted through a carnival megaphone. The original, Rauschenberg on roller skates with parachute wings billowing behind him, is already kinetic with absurdity and grace. Keene's versions heighten that energy with syncopated, graphic intensity. The figure is multiplied in color, not in motion, and while the parachute's volume is flattened, it gains theatrical exaggeration through Keene's jagged yellows and structural greens. The text scrawled across each panel, naming the 69th Regiment Armory, CBS Studio, and Judson Dance Theater, collides archival detail with visual bravado. If Gorgoni's photograph captures a fleeting, surreal choreography, Keene turns it into a punk rock poster, less documentation, more resurrection. This vibrant pair of paintings draws from an iconic 1964 photograph showing a constellation of artists who would profoundly shape post-war American art. Standing are choreographer Merce Cunningham, composer John Cage, curator Dorothy Canning Miller, and painter Jasper Johns. Seated are artists Robert Rauschenberg and Kenneth Noland. Keene's compositions emphasize their collaborative spirit while humorously underlining the ways these figures refuse tidy categorization, famously described as being independent of any particular movement. On the right, a large figure based on Rauschenberg stands in active contrast, bathed in expressive strokes and surrounded by stacks of silkscreens, an homage to his signature medium, and a nod to the chaotic inventiveness that defined his work. The image of Robert Rauschenberg stooping down to engage with his pet turtle named Rocky and a black cat in his New York studio during the 1970s is the basis for this pair of painted interpretations. Photographed in his Lafayette Street loft, an entire building he purchased in 1965, the moment captures the artist in a rare pause, playful and domestic, surrounded by non-human companions. Keene's versions preserve that crouched posture and curious gesture, reimagining the turtle and cat as graphic, stylized forms while inscribing the location, 381 Lafayette Street, and context, purchased Westbury Building, into the composition itself. Rauschenberg's soft loafers, tiled floor, and the quiet intimacy of the studio animate the original photograph, while the painted versions exaggerate and flatten the scene into emblematic storytelling. The source image for this pair is a 1952 photograph by Hazel Larson Archer, capturing Rauschenberg and Elizabeth Schmidt-Jennerjan mid-dance at Black Mountain College, where Rauschenberg's artistic path truly began. In his reinterpretation, Keene preserves the photo's ecstatic physicality, Rauschenberg's arched back and outstretched arms, Jennerjan's lifted leg, distilling their gestures into flattened, boldly outlined forms. The forested background becomes a rhythmic pattern of vertical green, while Keene's hand-painted text places the scene firmly in North Carolina and reinforces the Black Mountain ethos of collapsing the boundary between art and life. Rauschenberg's early experiments with photographic processes, including cyanotypes made in collaboration with Susan Weil, represent a key foundation of his interdisciplinary approach. The painting here is based on a well-known cyanotype from 1950, in which Weil is shown in profile, skirt flared, holding a cane. The negative image renders her luminous and spectral against the deep blue, a visual language that Keene directly channels in his doubled, silhouetted re-rendering. By multiplying the figure and placing it against a similarly saturated blue field, Keene echoes the formal ghostliness of the original, while turning it toward figuration and graphic rhythm. Keene's homage to Rauschenberg's homage to Friedrich Kiesler, 1981, turns the stark dignity of the original collage, a melancholic male figure in a red and orange aviator cap set amid a teeming field of printed debris, into a serial icon. The original work, now held in the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, is one of Rauschenberg's late combines, dominated by transfer images, newsprint textures, and a balance of color blocks and photographic ghosts. Keene isolates the central figure and repeats it like a propaganda motif, laying over the solar disk and crop diagrams that mimic the whirring noise of Rauschenberg's composition, but drain it of its anxious opacity. In the first painting, the word homage appears upright like a votive plaque, suggesting reverence, but also interruption. The second doubles down on the mass-reproduced feel, flattening the emotional register. Together, they read like concert posters for a thinker eclipsed by his own mythos. Keene's double rendering of Rauschenberg with 3 dogs inside his Captiva studio begins with 2 photographs, one by Shunk Kender of Rauschenberg, kneeling beside his dog Laika while working on a transfer drawing in his Lafayette Street studio in 1968, and another by George Chinsey from the 1990s, showing the artist playing with his dogs at home in Florida, boots on, surrounded by fur and affection. In response, both paintings pivot the moment into fable. One version amplifies the mid-century domestic modernism of the setting, the angular dogs reimagined as spectral familiars, while the other tilts the scene toward a kind of community theater, with blocky figures and rigid composition that read almost like stage directions. Both versions maintain the studio's modular energy, stacked works, hanging cords, painterly clutter, but elevate the gesture of reaching toward the dogs into something ceremonial. The phrase ongoing dialogue between mediums arcs above them, half proclamation, half benediction. Keene's title makes clear he sees this not just as Rauschenberg with pets, but as a sketch of the artist in continuous, polymorphous exchange, with animals, assistants, architecture, and materials all equally in play. Keene's 2 renditions of the 1976 Time magazine cover featuring Rauschenberg turn a moment of media canonization into a carnival of painterly riffs. The original cover, shot in the artist's Captiva studio, exudes relaxed confidence, Rauschenberg in sunglasses and chambray, framed by his own vibrant works and a seascape painting foregrounded like a window into his world. Keene retools this image with kinetic shorthand. Rauschenberg's face is rendered in fuchsia and black with a sly tilt, his shirt flared open like a game show host mid-gesture. In place of photographic detail, Keene splinters the background into a syncopated array of quasi-silhouettes, twin figures on a plinth, fragments of paintings, bristling vertical forms, each a gestural echo of Rauschenberg's own visual vocabulary. The red border of time is hinted at, but overtaken by Keene's scrawl. Rauschenberg Time magazine cover, the phrase stretching across both versions like a claim to territory. What began as mass circulation here becomes folk iconography, not just a portrait of an artist, but of his absorption into the machinery of recognition. In Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg at Some Art Opening, the artist riffs on a well-known photograph of the 2 artists mid-laugh, glasses in hand, here translated into a loose, theatrical tableau of cartoonish camaraderie and painterly bravado. With his signature visual shorthand, heavy outlines, gestural brushwork, and a flattened, deliberately awkward spatial logic, the painter reimagines the scene not as a documentary moment, but as a mythologized origin story. The handwritten text above and below the figures, method of combining disparate subjects, nods both to Rauschenberg's famed combines and to the pairing of two very different artists whose paths were deeply entangled, especially in their early careers. What emerges is not so much an homage as an animated footnote. Johns and Rauschenberg not as canonical giants, but as characters in a frenetic, stylized anecdote, painted with the same irreverence and affection the artist brings to his renderings of their work. Keene's pair of Captiva paintings, rendering the modest Waldo cottage where Rauschenberg lived and worked for decades, translates the house's calm tropical seclusion into a riot of stylized brushwork and color. The first version bathes the cottage in painterly dappled light, the suggestion of a shadowy plant or palmetto superimposed across the facade, while the second pushes the structure's geometry and chromatic temperature further toward crispness and graphic clarity. With their repeated motifs, the same building scene twice, the same Captiva title inscribed above, these paintings form a dialogic diptych, celebrating a site that served as refuge, laboratory, and mythic base for Rauschenberg's later life and output. In his two vibrant panels titled Fish House, Keene turns his brush toward one of the most iconic structures on Rauschenberg's Captiva Island property, the stilted studio affectionately known as the Fish House. With its candy-striped roof and dock jutting forward like a stage, Keene renders the house in his signature style of exuberant brush strokes and flattened planes of color, collapsing atmospheric perspective into decorative rhythm. The original photograph by Laurie Lambrecht, documenting the building's quiet presence over the water, is here converted into an image as buoyant and performative as the works that once emerged from within it. Keene's palette, electric blues, sherbet oranges, and seafoam greens, invokes Florida's subtropical hues while allowing the house to pulse with theatrical personality. Text elements like Fish House and the ever-present SK7/25 fuse architectural portrait with annotated homage, making this less a depiction of place than a painter's rehearsal of myth. Rauschenberg's 1959 Canyon, one of his most iconic combines, serves as the subject for Keene's vividly expressionistic tribute, reimagining the original's unruly assemblage through bold, flattened brushwork. The stuffed bald eagle, so controversial it famously prevented the work from being sold, takes center stage in both works, its wingspan exaggerated in Keene's rendering to underscore its cultural weight. Keene flattens and abstracts the collage elements and gestural marks that surrounded the eagle in Rauschenberg's original, translating the chaotic poetry of the combine into a kind of painted diagram or folk history glyph. What was once tactile becomes graphic. The suspended pillow, for instance, is distilled into a glyph-like form at the bottom of the painting, as if to emphasize the odd, almost totemic compositional logic of the original. While Rauschenberg's work was dense with material and meaning, Keene's interpretation leans into legibility and reverence, spotlighting Canyon as a moment of mythic breakthrough in American art and a crystallization of Rauschenberg's radical new visual language. Keene's a pamphlet for LACMA. Quarter Mile appears less a direct evocation of the quarter-mile or two-furlong piece itself than a reimagining of the printed exhibition pamphlet produced for its 2018 LACMA showing. flattening the layered experience of Rauschenberg's 750-foot sprawl into the repeatable structure of a mass-distributed handout. Keene captures both the banality and the strange reverence we assign to such ephemera. The dense, linear arrangement of colored forms mimics the layout of reproduced panels, while the scrawled title serves as both descriptor and critique, pointing to the institutional packaging of artistic monumentality. In doing so, Keene wryly underscores the gap between the immersive encounter with Rauschenberg's work and the mediated, thumbnail view offered by museum collateral. In his vivid and expressive style, Keene continues his exploration of Rauschenberg, zeroing in on the iconic photographs of Rauschenberg with his early white paintings and the Judson Dance Theater collaborators perched on a stack of mattresses. Keene's reinterpretation distills this critical moment of artistic cross-pollination between painting, performance, and conceptual art into a bold tableau that both celebrates and questions legacy. The flattened, near-cartoonish figure of Rauschenberg sits beneath a stylized rendering of the white paintings, with floating text like, "Titles are of much importance and forerunner of every post-war movement," broadcasting the critical discourse that has followed these works. Meanwhile, the stack of mattresses, rendered in thick strokes and topped with a reclining figure, nods both to Rauschenberg's collaborations with Merce Cunningham and the sculptural irreverence that later fueled the Combines. By bringing together visual quotes, didactic slogans, and formal pastiche, Keene assembles a reflexive homage that walks the line between reverence and satire, reminding us that art history is not static, but a series of images and ideas constantly being reperformed. Keene's painting draws from Retroactive Tears, 1963, one of Rauschenberg's seminal silkscreen works, reinterpreting its pop-inflected imagery through a bold, gestural language of flattened planes and schematic forms, where Rauschenberg layered photographic transfers from space exploration to political portraiture into a complex surface of mediated American iconography. Keene responds with a painterly doubling that emphasizes repetition and symmetry, echoing the silkscreen's mechanical reproduction while asserting a raw immediacy. His diptych format and graphic brushstrokes distill Rauschenberg's collage of JFK, parachute, and fruit into a vivid, almost comic strip syntax, reanimating the original's mass media density with expressive analog urgency. Keene's diptych, derived from the LACMA installation of the 1/4 mile or two furlong piece, rewires institutional sobriety into something closer to a fever dream. In the original photograph, Rauschenberg's sprawling photo collage unfurls in measured panels along white walls under a gridded skylight, a space of quiet, curated density. Keene, by contrast, paints the hallway as if it were shaking itself awake. The geometry is intact, but barely. Columns buckle, floor reflections warp, and the ceiling grid morphs into a turbulent aquamarine lattice. In both versions, the line of works becomes a band of spectral silhouettes and vibrating color blocks, loosely echoing the figures in Rauschenberg's Hiccups or Borealis series. Rauschenberg 1/4 mile barrels across the bottom like a marathon banner, while LACMA floats in the upper corner, ironically corporate. The gallery is no longer a container, it's part of the Combine. Keene's pair of paintings riff on the tangled audacity of Monogram, 1955 to 1959, Rauschenberg's infamous Combine featuring a taxidermied Angora goat encircled by a tire atop a heavily worked canvas. The reference image flattens this unruly object into something almost formal, a centered composition the goat now staring into the lens like a willing accomplice in its own myth-making. Keene pounces on this clarity. His first painting renders the scene with a staccato rhythm, angular fields of color boxed in like puzzle pieces. In the second, the goat grows more iconic, a coppery beacon radiating warmth, the tire a golden halo. The paint application is frantic, almost furious, yet there's a strange reverence at play. By filtering Monogram through his own ecstatic brushwork, Keene doesn't just depict the object, he restages its stubborn resistance to classification, treating it not as sculpture, painting, or performance, but as a living symbol, still kicking. Keene's version of Bed responds directly to Rauschenberg's radical 1955 work, which fused a vertically hung pillow, sheet, and quilt with smeared toothpaste and dripped paint, a gesture that upended distinctions between painting, sculpture, and the everyday. Here, Keene's translation flattens that wild materiality into a vibrant painted grid. He captures the quilt's geometric pattern in a rigid checkerboard of red, yellow, and blue, while the upper section evokes the chaotic folds of the pillow and sheet through vigorous, slashing brushwork. It's both tribute and parody, a painted image of a painting made of a bed, mimicking texture through rhythm and repetition. Rather than mimicking Rauschenberg's use of real fabric and found materials, Keene paints everything by hand, compressing the original's improvisational tactility into the language of his own production line visual shorthand. It's an oddly fitting tribute to a work that was never meant to be precious. Keene's rendering of Yoix, 1954, flattens the dense, tactile chaos of Rauschenberg's red paintings into a graphic and buoyant schema, where the original deployed oil, fabric, and newsprint with raw immediacy, dripped, squeezed from the tube, slathered in thick impasto. Keene offers a kind of cartoon compression, distilling the painting's physicality into legible, high-key pattern. His red stripes are clean-edged and buoyant, less agitated gesture than rhythmic notation. The polka dots, once embedded in collaged fabric and newsprint, now float free as stylized punctuation. In Rauschenberg's hands, red was a provocation, an Albertian problem to solve through excess. In Keene's, it's a visual hook, replayed in serial riffs, signaling homage and ironic distance in equal measure. Keene's treatment of the collaborative 1950 blueprint photogram by Rauschenberg and Susan Weil reads as a kind of painterly resurrection, not just of the image, but of its process. The original, a life-size cyanotype made by placing Weil's body directly onto light-sensitive paper, has a spectral lucidity. The figure both emerges from and dissolves into the blue. Keene seizes on this visual contradiction and splits it into two figures, painted side by side with high-key whites and lemon yellows edged in noirish black. In the first version, the outlines tremble with a sense of urgency, the paint laid down in slashing diagonals and compressed strokes. The second is more robust and symmetrical, nearly poster-like, with musculature exaggerated and shadow flattened. Keene inscribes Rauschenberg, Susan Weil, 1950, in a punchy scrawl, foregrounding the co-authorship often lost in canonized retellings. By doubling the figure and embedding their names at opposite poles, Keene doesn't just translate the photogram, he reasserts its authorship as a shared act, positioning the image as both origin and echo. Keene's paired paintings of the main studio at Rauschenberg's 20-acre estate on Captiva Island convert a site of prolonged private labor into something bright, graphic, and oddly ceremonial. The source image, a clean, frontal view of the studio, palms trimmed back to reveal its crisp white plains, radiates quietude. Keene explodes that calm, reconfiguring the architecture as a Technicolor pavilion. Each version stages the studio against a blue-striped sky, flanked by blazing palm trees and serrated greenery, the whole scene vibrating with color-blocked emphasis. Captiva Residency is lettered below like a tourist marquee, both anchoring and undercutting the image. Where the original photograph suggests a remote site of production, Keene's renderings project something more extroverted, the house not as retreat, but as emblem. By pushing the building forward, stripping it of its silence, and bathing it in stagey color, Keene reanimates Captiva not as Rauschenberg's shelter, but as a symbol, a stylized temple of American experimentalism. Keene's two portraits of Rauschenberg and the Angora goat from Monogram seize on a moment already thick with self-mythologizing. Gianfranco Gorgoni's 1976 photograph of the artist at his Smithsonian retrospective, flanked by Monogram, 1955 to 1959, and Estate, 1963. It's a calculated tableau of legacy, man, beast, and machine-age canvas staged together in institutional triumph. Keene flattens this retrospective image into a painted broadside, rendered with jarring immediacy in teal, mustard, and lipstick red. The goat's Baroque texture becomes a graphic snarl of zigzags and swipes. Estate is abstracted into pattern, its silkscreen scaffolding now a festive canopy. Rauschenberg's face, calmly worn in the original, hardens here into a spectral icon, outlined in slashing pink. Across both paintings, Keene distills the moment into headline form. The celebrated combines, as if the legacy were already a collectible. The duplication doesn't dilute, it vibrates. In Keene's hands, the quiet authority of a press photo becomes something closer to a rock poster, homage shot through with noise. Keene's diptych, based on the erased de Kooning, jolts Rauschenberg's quietest act of iconoclasm into something louder, sharper, and almost exuberantly defiant. Where the original, shown here in its framed, spectral stillness, hovers at the edge of visibility, all ghost line and residue, Keene's versions come alive in electric blue, as if dragging the erased marks back into the world by force. The de Kooning lines are not merely recovered, they're amplified, angular, zigzagging, edged in mint and navy like agitprop glyphs. Across both versions, Keene punches in stenciled lettering. Erased de Kooning before erased, a tautological snarl that wraps the whole project in an ironic koan. The gesture isn't reverent. It's a tug of war with the sanctity of erasure itself. Where Rauschenberg's act was an erasure as gesture, Keene's is a gesture as graffiti, his bold diagonals and cartoonish bolding making clear, some ghosts don't want to stay gone. Keene's rendering of Peter Hujar's portrait of Mercy Cunningham and John Cage hinges on a raw, graphic shorthand that collapses the precision of Hujar's lens into something more like a stage sketch, immediate, performative, and volatile. The photograph is all poise and stillness. Cunningham's posture is casual yet exacting, while Cage's closed expression and crossed hands suggest a quieter internal rhythm. Keene's two interpretations trade that quiet for a blunt expressionism, capturing the figures in stark, bone-white strokes against a blackened void. Their clothing becomes armor, their faces masks. Even their names, lettered jaggedly across the panels, serve as a kind of title card, asserting identity where Hujar offered intimacy. The two variations differ in tone. The first leans into a theatrical flair with wider gestures and glowing highlights. The second is tighter, almost solemn, though no less stylized. Together they form a diptych of homage and distortion, reducing two titans of chance and movement into graphic archetypes. Keene's two interpretations of Factum I and Factum II lock into Rauschenberg's original loop of repetition, but torque the register towards something more fevered and frontal. The source photograph shows the originals as quietly fraught, collaged fragments and gestural marks arranged with a studied looseness. But Keene's versions strip out the cigarette smoke subtlety and crank up the contrast. The black swipes get bolder, the red T's more declarative, and the photographic elements are distilled into loud, mask-like icons. Notably, the hazy photo transfer trees in Rauschenberg's works become stylized ciphers under Keene's brush, like warning signs rather than memories. Where the originals hover between accident and design, Keene's variations thump forward in a cadence closer to mural or signage. The effect isn't parody so much as over-articulation, a doubling that insists, not suggests. Thanks for joining me today. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel and check out my other art history lectures. See you next time.